Well everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at the Google Pixel 3 and see how this phone holds up in 2023. Now, this phone came out in 2018 and it was honestly a very surprising phone because it honestly, to be honest, it kind of came on the heels of the Pixel 2 series, which were pretty decent. The Pixel 2 XL was a great phone, but alongside the Pixel 3, there was the Pixel 3 XL, which was arguably one of the weirder phones Google's ever made. And since then, I think the 3 lineup kind of had a weird, undertone to it. But I will say, in my opinion, the Pixel 3 was actually a pretty decent phone. Now, I will leave some phones linked down in the description. If you want to pick up these phones from there, you can pick them up from there. You can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the Google Pixel 3, on the front of this phone, you had a pretty decent 5.5-inch P OLED display. Now, it was a 1080p panel, so it really wasn't anything we haven't seen before, but I kind of liked it because it did have, one, it had a little bit less bezel compared to the Pixel 2. The Pixel 2 XL, I think, still had less bezel overall, but the Pixel 3 actually looked like a pretty good phone. I mean, in 2018, some of the phones in the market at that moment were the Galaxy S9, we had the iPhone XS and XR that came out that year too. So this phone kind of matched in line a little bit, still had thicker bezels compared to those phones, but I think arguably it looked like a very good phone when it first came out. Now, on the bottom, we had our USB Type-C port, which was great. We had no headphone jack on this phone. I think Google removed it during this time, which is okay. We kind of already expected most manufacturers to kind of do it at that moment. But overall, in my opinion, the front, the sides of this phone, definitely not anything crazy bad or anything like that. Like, I don't think there was a big hardware defect with these phones at that moment either. So that may have been kind of a good advantage with this type of phone during that, specific moment. Now, on the back of this phone, we did actually have kind of a little bit of an interesting setup. And when I say interesting, I mean they didn't even change the back of this phone for like so many generations. And I feel like Google could have easily done that. So on the back of this phone, we had like the standard aluminum build that a majority of probably of us are kind of used to as of this moment. We also had the, kind of shard of glass back at the top, which was kind of nice. And then on top of all that, we had our single camera setup on the top left. Now, I was really happy because this phone did end up bringing wireless charging. Since then, I don't really wireless charge my phones anymore, since that does kind of degrade the battery a little bit faster in my opinion. But it is nice to have those types of features. That way, even if I don't do it, someone else could probably end up using it. And I'm glad that this phone actually had that type of capability during that moment. Now, on top of that, we did also have, our standard build quality. We had IP certification on this phone too. So this was still a very premium feeling phone with a lot of capability. I was still a humongous fan of the way this whole entire phone looked for sure. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now, in the camera setup, this is a very interesting thing, that was kind of going on with this specific phone. So on the back of this phone, on the back of the Pixel 3, we had a single 12.2 megapixel wide-angle lens, but on the front, we had a dual camera setup. So we had a wide 8 megapixel lens, then we had an 8 megapixel ultra-wide camera. Now, this was a very interesting thing that Google did here. They did the same thing with the Pixel 3 XL as well. And I just never understood the craze at, during that moment of putting a dual camera setup on the front, but a single camera setup on the back. If you think about it, even during this moment, a lot of phones had multiple camera setups. Google was really the only one who was kind of slow to adopt it, which is weird because Google is notorious of having some of the best cameras of their phones. And really enough, their phones were the slowest to adopt, multiple camera setups. The iPhones during this moment already had dual camera setups for years. Samsung on their S9 Plus already had a dual camera setup, and their Note 9 that came out this year also had it. So wasn't really too sure what Google was doing this specific year. They were relying way too much on software, but I still think the camera really isn't too bad. It's really not that bad of a camera. I think it was actually pretty good. But they rely too much on software, and that was kind of the problem for me. When I get a phone and when I use a phone, and from what a lot of people were stating at that moment too, it's always nice to have multiple cameras and as many features as possible. And it's nice to kind of interchange between those features. I feel like in this camera, and even now, the same thing I think applies. There's not really too many features inside of a Google Pixel camera when compared to a Samsung camera or even some other manufacturers, but it's still a really good quality photo and video that you're getting. So I think that's what a lot of people were kind of thinking at this moment, but I think the biggest thing that a lot of people were looking at for Pixels for their basically was their camera. And I feel like this started to be kind of the tipping point where people started to kind of sway away from the Pixels because their camera really wasn't that much better or even better at all compared to the competition. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. In terms of software and longevity, these are, like we mentioned before, some of the main reasons people would go ahead and buy a Google Pixel. They just last for a very long amount of time. Now the Pixel 3s have been kind of discontinued, so there isn't really a big reason to go and pick up this specific phone, but a big thing to keep in mind is that with the Pixel 3, there's still quite a bit of a development community behind all of the Google Pixels. So even if you plan on buying this phone, you're probably still going to be getting a phone that's going to get some, aftermarket, considered aftermarket software updates, meaning custom ROMs. So they're not coming from the stock developer. They're not coming straight from Google. But I mean, I've seen a lot of people end up porting over Android, the newest versions of Android on some of the oldest phones I could ever imagine. In fact, I think the Nexus 1 was still getting some versions of software in there. But I think regardless, something like the Pixel 3, if you're willing to root it and you're willing to custom ROM it, then this is perfectly fine. But if you're not willing to do that kind of stuff, then I really do think this is probably not a phone to go ahead and buy. On top of that, I will say the kind of energy of actually custom ROMing your phones has kind of gone down. I feel like not a lot of people are custom ROMing their phones anymore. So I feel like because stock software has gotten so good, you might as well just stick with it, especially from a security standpoint. So just kind of one of those things to keep in mind. It's not the end of the world, but just one of those things to keep in mind in the back of your head. Now, in terms of performance, the Google Pixel 3 has that Qualcomm Snapdragon 845 chipset inside of it with 4GB of RAM. Now, there's a few things to keep in mind here. One, 4GB of RAM I don't think was that low of amount of RAM to have on a phone back then in 2018. So I won't really give it too much, annoyance there, because even the Galaxy S9, I think of that year, also had the same amount of RAM. And also I would like to add that, with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 845 chipset, I mean, that was the same chipset that was inside of all the other phones as of that year's too. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. A majority of the time, like now, you would think that they would put some watered down chipset or something like that. Not the case. It was pretty much the same exact chipset as the main flagships, which was really nice. And, the only time they even really switched away from it, or they've done it a few times, but with the Pixel 4 and the Pixel 5 of 2020, I think they were trying to find exactly where to land. So that was totally understandable in my opinion too. I think the Pixel 3 though was, from a 2018 perspective, still a pretty good phone. It totally makes sense of what they did. And I think from the performance side, realistically speaking, it's a much smoother performing phone than a lot of other phones back in that day and age. I think below the iPhones is pretty much just the Pixel 3 in 2018. That was a very smooth performing phone, and because it got so many versions of software, that thing actually ended up lasting for quite a bit of time, which was honestly very cool. So that was another really big advantage for this type of device, and that was one reason why I would look at something like the Pixel 3 and I would be super happy about it. So I think the smoothness of this phone and the performance of this phone was actually pretty good. It wasn't maybe the best performing phone of 2018, but it was still pretty decent for the most part in my opinion. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. In the battery life segment, this thing had a 2,915 milliamp battery, so definitely not the smallest size battery of all time, but especially if you wanted the better size battery, you would probably go for the Pixel 3 XL at that moment. So to kind of sum up this whole entire video, what I'll definitely tell you is, I definitely do think that the Google Pixel 3 is probably not really worth it anymore, but it doesn't mean that it was a bad phone. I feel like with a phone like the Google Pixel 3, it was still a very solid phone for so many years, and because it lasted so long, it didn't really make too much sense to even start, buying this phone towards the end of its life. But that's what you get with a Pixel. You get such a long-lasting phone that lasts, just not even in terms of software, but also the hardware sometimes. But this was probably the one area and the one phone where Google started to switch away. I mean, I feel like the camera of this phone wasn't that great or the greatest of that year. I feel like the performance was good, and I feel like this phone was smooth, but I feel like the battery life could have been better. I feel like there was a lot of area in this phone that could have been better, and for Google kind of making the price tag what it wasn't even that good of a priced phone at that moment either. So, in my opinion, I mean, you'd probably be better off if you buy a Pixel 5 or Pixel 4a. Those would be better phones than the Pixel 3 in my opinion in this day and age. So that kind of covers it up there, to be honest. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.